Des, how are you?
Hi, I'm well, and we are live at lunchtime. And today it's live with Dan Latto. I have been asked to be interviewed by Daniel Latto, who is a property investor of 22 years, an entrepreneur. He's built a wonderful portfolio of properties. He's also managed to do that, managing them remotely. But of course, like most landlords out there who surrender their business to the hands of others, as the years are going by since 2017 and the changes in the law with civil penalties, many landlords have become interested to know where they stand with the different parts of the law. So Dan got in contact and said, can I interview you to find out the answers to the questions that I want answering and other people he knows in the industry would like to have answered to. So Dan,
Perfect.
welcome.
Thank you.
I'll pass over to you. It's nice to be interviewed.
Thank you very much for having me on your show. I really appreciate it today. So one of the first questions that I've got for you, obviously there's loads of licensing coming in now, and it's quite confusing, I find, and certainly the people I speak to, they're a little bit confused by it as well. So there's two different types, really. The first one's HMO licensing, and then the other one is another type of licensing, but on single lets. Can you just explain what that is and the difference between the two, if that's possible?
Absolutely. So there are three types of licensing. One is called selective licensing, and that relates to buy-to-let properties, and it's normally in a designation that the council has selected where they will claim they want to improve the housing or the housing stock or how it's managed. So that's selective licensing and buy-to-let. Then there's HMO, and HMO means house in multiple occupation. And there are two types of HMO license. There's the mandatory one, and that applies where 5 people live and they're not related, and that only needs 2 of them not to be related. So you could have a family of 4 and 1 friend. That would be an HMO. You could have, but a family of 4 with 1 friend would be exempt from the licensing, although it would be an HMO. So we have to get very, very careful on mandatory licensing and additional licensing. The additional licensing kicks in with 3 people, and mandatory kicks in with 5. And it's normally where the landlord does not live in the house. And if the landlord does live in the house, he can have up to 2 lodgers before he has to apply for a license. So if he gets a 3rd lodger, and this gets very, very confusing. And we'll talk a little bit about that a little bit later on, because we've had a story this week which is quite sad. And the landlady is probably going to end up bankrupt as a result. So
wow, okay.
Yeah, because also selective licensing.
One of the popular things in more recent times is not going for full licensing on HMOs with 5 people, but what people term as mini-mos, or that's definitely what I call them, but I'm sure it's something you're familiar with. And so in terms of the licensing on mini-mos, how different is that than full-on licensing of a HMO with 5 people?
Right. Okay, so that's very interesting, because a mini-mo has all the same management regulations as a mandatory licensed HMO. So as soon as you have 3 unrelated people in a property, mandatory HMO management regulations come in. So management regulations, there are 11 of them. The ones that are relevant are from 3 to 10. And number 3 is a very simple one, like just putting a sign up saying who is the manager of the property and how to contact them. So yeah. HMOs, a lot of regulation, a lot of things you've got to follow. Whereas in buy-to-let, there's lots to follow, but the implementation and the fining is not as easy for the council as it is with an HMO.
Yeah. Okay. And you mentioned that you had somebody who had a problem with licensing. And was that somebody who just didn't bother? Or because I've heard horrible stories, where people have done, say, rent to rent, and it's a 4-bed. They haven't got permission from the mortgage lender. They haven't licensed it, and they've got 5 people with, the lounge has been turned into a bedroom. Is that something that you see on a regular basis, would you say?
Yeah, we see that on a regular basis, and it is the council's new weapon, I would say. They are hunting down properties that have council tax registered in a limited company name generally, and going to those properties to find out how they're occupied. And when they get there, they're finding that either it's not licensed or it's not following management regulations, but the landlord, through his agent, has generally done a simple buy-to-let through an agency and not realize that it's being subdivided and sublet to multiple people. But the person ultimately responsible for that is the landlord. He's the one who receives the fine, and he's the one who will also have to do all the work to either evict or to regularize it.
So just to clarify, if you get someone who, let's say it's a 5-bed house, all the bedrooms, you rent it to one person who says they're a family, and then they sublet it to 5 separate tenants. They don't live there, so it's clearly a HMO. The landlord is still the person that gets fined for that. What about the person who is then, is it illegally subletting, or is it just without permission of the landlord?
Right. They're doing it without the permission of the landlord, so they are in breach of their tenancy.
Yeah.
And we have a number of cases going on at the moment where people have a family has rented a house. A classic case we have now in East London. Family rented the house. Husband and wife decide to have an argument, say they're getting divorced, don't actually get divorced, but decide that they're going to return to their country of origin and see if they can reconcile. And while they go return to their country of origin, they say to 3 people who work for them, why don't you move into our house? And while you move into our house, you look after it, you make sure everything's okay. And then you pay the rent to us and we'll pay the rent to the landlord. They don't pay the rent to the landlord. The subtenants are paying the landlord, the what they call the mean landlord, the landlord in the middle.
Yeah.
And they're in a property that's now in an area that, one, can't be it's got additional licensing, so it needs a license. 2, it's got something called Article 4, which is planning, so it needs to have planning permission to be an HMO. It's been turned into an HMO. The landlord has got no idea about this because it's only come about because they've gone to change agent, and the new agent has gone to meet the tenants and gone, who are you?
Yeah.
So the whole process, luckily it was caught and we nipped it in the bud for the landlord, but the landlord was distraught. So what we had to do is apply for a temporary exemption notice, which the council, luckily in this case, did give it, because the landlord, that's the purpose of the temporary exemption notice, is to, when you find out something should be licensed and it isn't, and all of the other bits and pieces. So they took that properly, but they wanted evidence that eviction was happening. So notices were served. And now with the new legislation that's coming on the 1st of June, they are also more than 6 months in arrears. So now we can reissue the Section 8 and do 4 weeks for possession and get them out. Well, quite interestingly, the tenant who is in his country of origin has told me today that his wife is in London and now they'd like to sort it out. Right. Because they've begun to realise that they're going to end up in a court. Mm-hmm. He's got a business in London. He's going to get a county court judgment for the arrears, etc., etc., etc. And all of a sudden, they're realising we need to do something.
Yeah, that
was one of the lucky cases where the landlord got away with it. But quite often, what happens is we've got one in West London. The agent spoke to the landlord. The landlord's a doctor professor in a university. So him getting a criminal record or any criminal activity like this does hamper his job, and he has to report it because, of course, he's educating people, etc. And in that case, they handed it to a firm of solicitors. The solicitors do conveyancing, landlord and tenant, but they didn't understand this part of the law, and they still haven't put in a temporary exemption notice 2.5 months later. They've tried to evict the tenants, and now the tenants are saying, well, we're not subletting, we've just got some friends in. So the tenants have now confirmed it's an HMO, but the council's already started the enforcement action. Wow. And it looks like that landlord, because he didn't appoint immediately and didn't give the agent the power to take action, which he should have done with us, because we were involved back in March, looks like that landlord's probably going to end up with a fine between 17,000 and 18,000 for not having the license. And as for the management regulations, well, of course, it was a family home. Now it needs to have the HMO regulations works done. So it needs all the fireproofing work done, the deep compartmentalization. So he's in lots and lots of trouble. This could end up 50,000, 60,000 pounds for him. So wow. He'll work this year for very little money.
And what's interesting about that is when you mention they passed it on to solicitors, and as we know, and you know, me and solicitors don't get on well. They've made a lot of money out of me as solicitors, but the solicitors walk around like they know it all, and they got it completely and utterly wrong.
Yeah. Well, there's various types of surveyors, and if you bought properties, I bought properties, and when you have a survey done, and they say for mortgage purposes, And you say, well, how did you get to the price? Well, I used the comparison method. And what does that involve? Well, I called around some estate agents and I got some prices. What, I paid you £800 to do that? But what about the property, its structure? So there's structural surveyors, there's quantity surveyors, there are all types of surveyors, like there are all types of doctors. And what's happening is we got people go to a solicitor who's experienced in landlord and tenant issues, so tenancies or conveyancing, but they're not clear on the operational application of what looks like another law. And that's why they end up, they're learning as they go. They make many mistakes. And of course, and I may have said this to you before, but they don't realize that in a council, there are two types of people. And for those who are old enough and of my generation, it's John Thor. It's John Thor as Jack Regan in the Sweeney, or John Thor as Inspector Morse. Whichever one you like, those are the two types of people you come across in council enforcement. Most of them are being taught like Jack Regan in the 70s, aggression, get them at all costs, they're all bloody villains, let's have them over, rather than Inspector Morse, who, well, let's look at the facts of the matter and let's work out whether he had motive and what was his motive, and did he actually really mean to commit this crime, or was it just a circumstances that came around? And what if it's just circumstances? Well, a £5,000 fine would be better than a £20,000 fine.
Yeah.
You know, it's that sort of approach, and you don't know which one you're going to get on which day, any given day of the week.
Yeah. Shocking. So, okay, so that's HMO licensing. What about selective licensing? What's all that about?
Selective licensing, what was one of the main reasons that a council will say selective licensing is so they can improve the housing stock and the management of that housing stock in the private rented sector. And it's normally because that council in the previous 20 years has not done enough to make neighborhoods good enough when they had the opportunity to. So they've become run down. But we see a classic example of Liverpool, who did it citywide. And after 5 years, it wasn't renewed by the central government because, of course, citywide, well, there are some beautiful parts of Liverpool. There are some terrible parts of Liverpool. Some parts need it, some parts don't. And you've seen it in Leeds, where you have a portfolio. And Leeds City Council is very, very, very strong on enforcement, Hare Hills being one of the main areas. Now, Hare Hills is very well known for having had lots of students in it, people in the past. It's very well known for social housing today, and landlords in the private renting sector providing housing that the council can't provide. And of course, some of those landlords have decided that social housing isn't for the best type of people, so they don't make their houses suitable. So they've invoked it for that reason. But good landlords like you will come along, make your house all compliant, make it all lovely. They impose selective licensing, and 3 days into the scheme, you've just got back from your skiing holiday in January, and you go, oh, I forgot to do my licensing. Oh, I haven't got the money in the bank. I'm waiting for the rents to come in because they're all late this month because of coronavirus. So you don't put your license application in until you've got the money, because it's not valid without payment. And then you find out that £500 license fee that you couldn't pay, you may as well have gone to a loan shark or a pawn shop and paid 100% interest per day for the few days it took you, because the fine is going to be between £2,000 and £2,500 if you get the application in before the council comes after you. And if the council comes after you before you put the application in, because you were completely oblivious or unaware of it because you don't live in the Leeds City Council area like yourself, Dan, then that fine is more likely to be between £6,000 and £7,000, because they're going to do an investigation and they want to recover their costs. So selective licensing is for buy-to-let landlords. It's normally in a designated area of a local authority, but for some, especially in London, it can be blanket, so the whole borough. So in London, there are 33 London boroughs.
Wow.
And more than a third have selective licensing. More than a third have additional HMO licensing, and the two don't cross over. But if you've got a minimo HMO, then and there's no additional licensing, then selective licensing applies, and the conditions will be the same as HMO management conditions. So the council is very, very powerful. And we advise, if you are applying for a license, that those license conditions you get on the license, if the council says to you, you must go to the house every Monday and check the bins have been put away after the bin men have been around in the license condition, and you agree to it,
yeah,
then that's a criminal offence when you don't do it. So we advise you, if you're going to get selective, when you get a selective license, go through it. And if you don't know what to do or who to contact, at least contact us so we can tell you, yep, those conditions are fair, those aren't. We had one in Salford recently. One of the conditions was to check the alleyways at the back of the houses and to make sure that the secure gates at each end of the alleyways were secure. Well, we put representation in and said there's no secure alleyway at the back of the house. And they said, oh yeah. And out of 17 different conditions, 12 of them we opposed, 9 of them they accepted, and 3 of them they said we're not going to change them.
Yeah.
We were okay with that. But what we've also done as a result of that is we've changed the policy in Salford. Yeah, in Salford. We've changed the policy with them, so they're going to make those apply the things we pointed out to them across their whole portfolio of licenses.
Very good.
Now, well, I think you say very good. Why was it wrong in the first place? And why did we give them that free consultancy through representations?
Well,
so the landlord paid to educate.
Yeah.
And that landlord had 17 properties.
You could call me cynical if you want, Des. You can, and you may. But when the local council say, oh, well, we're going to have a local, what do we call it? A local
consultation?
Consultation. I don't know what consultation means in your dictionary, but a consultation under the council's dictionary says we're going to include this and you're going to have to pay a lot of money for it. That's basically a consultation. I don't know who they consult or who they pretend to consult. I think it's the people who live there. But they just got all the answers and go, yeah, take your point, but we're going to license it anyway. That's my interpretation. I have a negative interpretation of councils generally, but the people who are actually putting these into place aren't the people at the forefront, it seems, who actually understand the rules and the regulations and why the rules and regulations are in place. And that then leads to them just making stuff up, hence you having to, go in and try and reject 12 of these things that they've put on, which, some of them I'm sure are ridiculous.
Well, it's very interesting you should mention that, because yesterday I had the second best conversation I've had in 2021 with an enforcement officer from a council. And I may as well call them out because she was lovely to speak to.
Yeah.
Torridge Council covers the area of Bideford in Devon. And Deborah White, happy to call out her name, she said to me, yes, I'm not enforcing on these people. We do have some concerns. I'm an HMO landlord and have been for 30 years. I understand what they have to know and do. What we're looking at is if they want this property to be an HMO, we have fire risk concerns to be addressed. Yeah. If they want to run it as 2 separate flats, well, there's a couple of other things that need to be done from a safety and fire point of view. But what we'd like to do is how we'd meet them at the property and we'd like to talk to them about it.
Wow.
And she said to me, personally, I don't know why people take on things they don't understand, like HMOs, and then hope they can fix it as they go. And I tend to agree with her. But I'm hearing some very good old-fashioned environmental health officers, is what they're called at the council, who are old school, who've been landlords themselves or are still landlords.
Yeah.
Even they are saying, I wouldn't get into the business now knowing what I know without having full training, a team around me. I can't do it today the way I used to. I've got to have a team. They've got to know what's required. And you've got to be able to jump when the council says jump. Now, this is becoming more and more clear. And some of the really tough councils, we did a big case last year with Northampton, and they were very, very aggressive. And we, at tribunal, it took them 7 years to prosecute the landlord. 7 years. Those people were in mortal danger, but every year they wrote a letter saying licensing would solve it. What actually solved it was him getting some civil penalties, us getting involved, us fixing the house. But what happened was a new head of housing standards came into the council in the process of going through the tribunal case. And when he realised what was going on, he won't say anything bad against his staff, but how they went about things was terrible, as far as I'm concerned. But what has happened is we've opened a good dialogue with him. He understands the landlord was ill. He understands the family is now taken over. He understands that we've brought it up to standard, and we've had what I would call a civilized human being conversation with a council officer about how the property can be improved in some of the areas that it needs improvement, rather than just say, yeah, we're going to prohibit the use there. They've actually come up and had what I would call, as you called it, a consultation with us. With what's best for the tenants, what's best for the landlord, and what's best for the council as they go forward.
So I don't understand
the way we expect it to be.
I just don't understand why the councils can't be. Well, I do understand why, because they want the bloody money. Let's face it. That's all the councils are strapped for cash, and it's like, well, what's the easiest, quickest way of doing it? Selective licensing, and let's do it over a large period. I mean, the amount of money that Liverpool then lost because they lost the ability to renew their selective licensing agreement would have been significant. So now I'm pretty sure that they're then looking for different ways of generating that cash. They'll just move on to the next poor victim. But why can we not have a grown-up conversation with councils? The council turns up and says, and the council will know who's taking the absolute mick and who isn't, because it's obvious, right? And let's separate them into one box. And those people are trying the best with what they've got and trying to do it. Well, you do. I can see you doing your best, but you've made some mistakes. Let's help you. We'll give you 30 days on a improvement notice, and let's do that. But and some of them are doing that, and some of them absolutely aren't, because it's easy money, and it's that I kind of object to, really.
Yeah, there's nothing. We're not going to be able to change that.
No,
there's nothing we can do. The same way as it was voluntary to wear masks in coronavirus, and now it's not voluntary. It became permanent, and we're going to be unable to do this. The problem that people haven't seen is that these laws were put in place in 2004. But when you actually look back at the history of room sizes and you look back at the regulations and what they say, they actually originate in 1936. And they haven't changed that much, apart from being made metric from imperial. Lots of things have been added because of circumstances like Grenfell, etc. So you can understand why they're doing them. But what has changed the most is when they 6th of April 2017 was when the Housing and Planning Act 2016 came into force with regard to civil penalties. And that changed the council's power from, if we prosecute, the money goes to central government and it costs us money, so they didn't bother, to we can keep the money from the civil penalties, which are an alternative to prosecution. And they were given the right to charge up to £30,000. Now, do they charge £30,000 for everything? No. And they've graded it, and all they have to do is write a policy. Now, if I want £30,000, I'm going to write a policy that's high-end stacked, that's going to get me as near to £30,000 every time. So there are councils for what we call regulation 4 safety offences. And one council can charge for exactly the same £5,000 against the landlord, and another £25,000-30,000. On average, there are some in the northwest charge 28 grand on average for regulation 4. Whereas down in London, the same council might charge you as a landlord, because you're a portfolio landlord, 20 grand. To another guy who's only got one property, so he doesn't have the knowledge, he might get away with 5 grand. And you think, well, actually, the guy who's getting the 5 grand, the chances of him doing it again are higher than the portfolio landlord, who he just needs to improve his processes. And they don't quite get that, and because they're not landlords themselves, most of them have no appreciation of what you're going through.
Yeah, absolutely. So have you got examples of where a client's come to you with a bit of a mess and then you've been able to step in and help?
Yeah, we have done loads and loads of those. And one of those was a classic example where a guy, it's a corporate guy, he's working in his job every day, and he buys a big house, 7 bedrooms. Now, he lives in another town about 10 miles away. He buys a house with the intention of moving in there with his family. Now, he's just started a family. They've got 2 kids. He said, I've got another one on the way. But the house was ideal. It just wasn't the right moment. So I gave it to an agent, and a 7-bedroom house. And generally, those houses are taken up by the council because they'll use them for social housing or whatever. But he gave it to an agent. The agent rented the property to a company, and the company put 7 of their employees in the house. So nothing wrong, proper agreement, everything's done. So the chap calls the council and says, do I need a license? Now, various emails and conversations went backwards and forwards, and the one question the council never asked was, do these guys who are living in the house have another house which is their main residence, or to be considered as their main residence? They never asked the question, and they told him to apply for a license. So he applies for the license, and it's granted. But while he's waiting for it to be granted, the house that he wanted to live in for himself, the council has reported him to the planning department for a breach of planning, because he's now got, as far as they're concerned, 7 people living in a property that's in what's a planning restricted area called Article 4, where more than 3 people creates an HMO. So planning enforcement start getting very, very stroppy. And he calls us because he's been in direct communication with these people, and now he's scared. And I mean very scared. Now, 2 days previously, another gentleman of the same country of origin had called me because he'd been through the same licensing and planning with the same authority, and said these people are racist. It begins with a wee word, letter B. And he told me the story, and they had fined him 60 or 70,000 pounds, and they basically were destroying him.
Wow.
I was like, so I went on to this council, and I'm talking to the gentleman in the planning department, and he says to me, well, Mr. So-and-so needs to understand the laws of England. And I stopped, and I've gone, he is a racist.
Yeah.
I stopped in there and I said, you need to stop right now. And from now on, the calls are going to be recorded. And we went through the process. We got the planning enforcement stopped because we could prove it was a company let. They were their employees, and we could prove that they didn't need a license. But of course, the licensing department has already had its £1,100, doesn't want to revoke the license, and now starts asking for things for which they're not entitled, i.e. the passports of the people who are living in the house, the address where they normally reside, etc. And now they're beginning to harass. Well, lo and behold, after a year, the landlord never got a response, but they kept asking us to prove things. And the law is very, very clear. They have to produce evidence beyond reasonable doubt that he's committed an offence.
Yeah.
Now, 2 years on, we're still waiting for the fee back, but he's moved on. The tenant, the workers who were living there, their contracts moved on, and now the house is being let to a family. And of course, he had to apply for a selective license, and it's been let to a big family, and he has verified they are a family, by the way. And so he's got a selective license. His HMO license is over, but the council took that money, don't want to give it back. He's having to sue them, and it's cost him money for legal costs because he picked up the phone, spoke to a council, and listened to their lies and their bad advice. And interestingly, when I read the emails of the person writing the emails, I thought she was one of the most senior people, but she wasn't. She was just a junior receptionist, I would say, receptionist in a call center who wrote emails. But obviously somebody was writing them for. But one part of section 254 about HMOs was he didn't know that, and he didn't know that they duped him into it. So we see this all the time. We've got another one where a lady has this is a terrible story, really.
Before you start that story,
Yeah.
One of the benefits of working from home is that the dog is barking. So let me let the dog in, which will stop the dog from barking. 1 second.
Great. Fantastic. Bring the dog in.
The joys of home working. Okay.
So let's talk about selective licensing and the issues with selective licensing. So we have a lady who came to us distraught. Distraught is not the word. I mean, I wouldn't say she had mental health issues at the time, but it was beginning to wear on her. She'd let her house out to somebody who used to live next door, her own family house. She moved out of a family house, rented it to another family who used to live in the house next door. And from the very first month, they never paid the full amount of rent.
Right.
But not only that, because it was her old family house, and this was her first time of being a landlord after her husband died, she didn't know anything about what she needed to do. She said, oh, yeah, you rent it. So eventually, after the arrears are at like 12 or 15,000 pounds, she says, enough is enough. I'm going to issue proceedings against you, and issues a Section 8 and goes to court and gets possession claim. At the court, the judge has made a mistake, and the tenant has worked out there's a mistake, and so the possession claim needs to be set aside. So the landlord says to the tenant, well, why don't you go into so-and-so's in town and get them to do the paperwork for you? So she sends the tenant in to see a solicitor, and the solicitor says, hold on a second, this house isn't licensed.
Oh, gosh.
It needs a selective license. So let's go and get that set aside. But while we're at it, let me go and confirm with the council it hasn't got a license, there's no application. And let's go for a rent repayment order.
Oh.
So the tenant proceeded to go for a rent repayment order, and having looked at the bank statements that they had to provide, there was no way that they couldn't afford to pay the rent. They could. And there was no way that they were living a lifestyle that was poor. It was quite obvious to me the amount that was being spent, and this is public record. I'm not saying anything that's not can't be found on the tribunal things. The amount of money that was being spent every month on apparently 7 kids. Now, I come from a family of 7 kids, so I know the money that gets spent. You don't go to Booker's to buy your family groceries. You don't spend hundreds of pounds every other day. What it turned out was they were running a food supply business for the local pub out of the house. Wow. They're also running a barber's out of the house. Oh. So this lady going for a rent repayment order, and the rent repayment order was for 12 months rent, totaling, I can't remember now, about £8,000 for the period that she could pick. We fought. It was a 7-hour first-tier tribunal. I didn't want my landlord to go through with it, but the judge insisted she came to the tribunal, so she did. It was very distressing for her. The sad part is at lunchtime, the judge said, go away the 2 sides and do a deal. Please do a deal. And I gave a very attractive deal to the tenant through the solicitor to go, but we didn't get to talk to the tenant. We spoke to the solicitor. The solicitor would not pass the deal across. We continued to the evening, and a judgment came through. And what we were very, very successful with was that the lady was rewarded 75% off the claim. 75% off. But what was key that the lady had never seen from the beginning was, one, that we could using general accepted accounting procedures, because of my accounting background, I knew we could offset the rent received in the period against the arrears. And I fought that case. That went to upper tribunal on appeal, and it was also found and upheld. That tenant never received a penny, because the money she was due was put against the arrears. They're still trying to get her out of the house. She's still not paying the rent. It's still not happening as it should do. But as a landlord, even in the selective licensing area, you could have licensing come in, and today you could have a tenant who has got in to screw you. You're receiving no money, but while they're sitting in that property, whether you like it or not, you have to go and get that license and comply with the conditions of that license even though the tenant has completely and utterly gone out of their way to never pay you and to completely play the system. Sad as it is, that's another horror story out there. So as you said, you've got some people who are coming in on maybe benefits, etc. You've got to make sure you're getting the money direct. You've got to make sure that if they need a top up, that you've got a guarantor.
Yeah.
Because licensing is going to come to anywhere where there are possibilities where the tenants or the landlords are not behaving in the way the council needs them to have nice neighbourhoods.
So interestingly, we never do top ups, and we used to a long time ago. And what basically happened was, I mean, actually, this was in the days when we used to get paid direct anyway, before having to wait for 2 months of arrears. But what would happen is, let's say it's £500 and the rent's 600. We'd always get the 500. We would never get the extra 100.
Yeah, because
it came direct from the tenant. And so I made a decision 10, 15 years ago. We're just not going to do that anymore. And so actually, and you know, some people want DSS tenants, LHA tenants, and some people don't. But we always price it slightly higher anyway. So and also we don't accept top ups. So if housing or benefit doesn't actually cover the rent, we can't rent to them. No. Obviously, we reference them and we treat all tenants exactly the same, but the rents are higher. And if so we don't accept top ups. But that whole thing right there, what it tells me is that if you're getting stuck, you need to get the right tool for the right job. And when you're dealing with the councils, most solicitors haven't got that level of experience, and they don't understand what utter people the councils are. Nearly swore. And you've got to get the right person for the right job to help you in that situation. And it's clear that, I've got licensing in Hare Hills in Leeds, which we spoke about before we came live, and I've applied for licensing, and I'm still having some anxiety about getting something wrong. And there's a knock on your door as soon as the council say to me, can we have a word? It's like, yeah, Des, have a word, because I don't want to do it. And that poor tenant who had all that anxiety with a 7-hour in the court. I mean, anyone who's been to court, it's quite a harsh thing to go through. Just the waiting, family court in my experience, but the waiting room alone is the most depressing place on any planet. But you've got to get the right people involved not waiting to see if it comes good. Right from the very start, as soon as you're having a council saying, can we have a word, Mr. Latto? It's like, yeah, you need to speak to my mate, Des. And it's without other solicitors, who I'm sure some are very good, you've got to get that person who's got the experience and knowledge of dealing with councils on a regular basis. And clearly you guys have that.
It's exactly what we do. And we've got two situations right now. Both landlords are big portfolio landlords. They have portfolios in one borough and portfolios in the neighbouring borough. One of them, he's got, I think it's £60,000 or £70,000 now of civil penalties, plus a rent repayment order that's nearly that again.
Yeah.
And the council and the process that we're going through with them is we've tried to uncover where they've made mistakes. They've not made one mistake in the process at all. In fact, they've submitted some things and they've said, that document we submitted, here's another document to make that document even better, because. Yeah. Now, we know that their enforcement is excellent. We also know the landlord with his portfolio, they've gone through his complete portfolio in that borough.
Yeah.
But he took them to first tier tribunal before he involved us. So he's fought himself. He's argued, and I must admit, his arguments were fantastic. But he was arguing them, so they could argue back with him, and he could argue back. And it's just like brothers and sisters arguing.
Who said
needed somebody else to get involved?
Yeah.
So what he did was he went to the country's leading HMO solicitors, and they did what they call representations for him. Interesting what they wrote, interesting what they said, but to no avail. He then sought the counsel of a barrister who also looked at it and thought, not so good, but couldn't do anything. Eventually, he came to us in desperation. And I will say desperation. The conversations I've had about suicidal thoughts, unable to sleep. What shall I do? Why are they doing this to me? Why me? How? Possibly. Now, I'll be frank with you. We went and we looked at the properties, and a good old-fashioned landlord in his 50s understands quiet enjoyment. You don't upset your tenants. Do I really need licensing? Surely they're separate flats. Are they really an HMO? All of these questions were going on, and all of these arguments were happening. Now, that council, not only have they gone back to the early part of the 1900s, 1911 to prove their case, they've also gone back and found the last living occupant of the property before this person owned it and got witness statements from them. Oh. And then as we've gone through everything we looked at, we've gone, it's really clear now when you look at the whole portfolio that the council's got enough evidence and now has brought in the highest level of barristers that when this goes to tribunal and appeal, the next stage is, when we've got all this evidence, it's a banning order.
Oh.
Right? Now, they'll go for a banning order because all the evidence is there. But when they get their banning order, of course, that destroys his whole portfolio in the neighbouring borough and anywhere else. So he's in a very, very serious position. But not only that, his net worth hasn't gone down. It's gone up recently. And yeah, he needed to do some works. He needed to do some stuff to come up to date. Now, not only did we take him through the process of doing the works, we've also taken him through what's called Housing Health and Safety Rating System training. So he understands what the council officer understands. He now understands what the fire safety is about. But he's in a position right now that we've got to work out with him, which we've already worked out what we're going to do. And because it's midway, we've got some few things to do before I can reveal it. But we have a strategy that's going to cut the council off at the knees. Cut them right off at the knees right now. But he has to do what he has to do. And some of that for a landlord is still going to cost a lot of money. But as we saw in a case recently, a landlord was quite frankly found to not be perfectly giving the information that the judge required. We had to remove his evidence though, because the criminal ramifications were too much.
Yeah. So
sometimes a landlord, and we find this too often, they go and try and fight and defend themselves, and actually they make it worse. And I've made a video about a year ago, and it was just like this. The more he said, the worse it got. The more he protested, the worse it got. The more he spoke about his innocence, the worse it got. And it was at that moment I remembered that, I can't remember, thou dost protest too much.
Yeah.
That actually, while you're trying to prove your innocence, the more you say, the more guilt you are telling them. And it is so obvious with most of the calls I take from landlords when they call me, they're in 15 minutes in the call, and I'm saying, based on what I've heard already, you've already told the council enough for them to have beyond reasonable doubt evidence, which is what they need to have. So on that basis, we've got to decide how we get you out of this now that you've said, I'm guilty.
Yeah.
I cannot describe this enough. Silence is golden. With the council, absolutely. Silence.
The new saying is, if in doubt, shut it, basically.
Yeah.
And if not in doubt, still shut it.
Yeah. Now,
just, yeah.
I talk about the silence. The right to silence is a British legal system process, which is more than 400 years old.
Yeah.
But the process, when we look back, it looks like it's more than 2,000 years old.
Wow.
And it comes from a guy called Jesus Christ who lived. And he exercised the right to silence in front of a guy called King Herod. That was after he'd been interrogated by two other levels of legislator. And at the top level, he's in front of a king. He remained in silence, as the account goes. And we investigated because I was really interested to know the oldest account of the right to silence. Now, I don't know about you, but that Bible book's been around a long time. And the right to silence, if that guy knew what to do 2,000 years ago, landlords need to heed that. It doesn't matter what your faith or belief is. Your right to silence is your best defence when a council calls.
See, I've had this with councils before. I live overseas. I live in Spain. If we go, well, what's for your address? And I go, well, here's my correspondence address. Then it's an address in Leeds. And they say, no, I want to know where you live. And it's like, no, mofo, you ain't finding out where I live. You can have my legally correspondence address. Well, what if we want to serve you with papers? Then you serve them at the address. Well, what if you don't get them? Well, that's my lookout, not yours. Obviously, we don't like it when I speak like that. But, you know, we've had quite a few wrangles with Leeds City Council. And I'm probably a little bit more aggressive than I should be, because I'm like, you know, you like it or lump it. You know, this is how I'm going to operate. And if not, then you need to serve papers and we'll just take it down to court level. But for the council, you know, do not trust. And I tell my kids this: I don't trust the police, I don't trust the council, I don't trust MPs. It's obviously MPs, because without saying, just don't trust anybody. Keep everything stum. Keep as quiet as you can. Get legal advice. And then the other side of this is that, you know, well, I told the council guy, and he said, yeah, that was fine. Okay, have you got evidence of that? No. Well, the only truth is truth that you can prove. Everything else is hearsay, right? So you know. Hence, you mentioned, well, from now on, all our calls will be recorded with the council worker, because you need proof, you need evidence. I learnt this in family court. You can't prove anything unless you've actually got physical evidence of it in some way or another. But if you're finding yourself going down this path and the council are right at the beginning of investigations, they need to get the right legal help. And I think that help is you guys. What's the next first step then? If someone's like there right now, and they might be watching this on a replay or they're listening to this because this will go on to podcast. If they're taking this information in, what's the best next step for them to do you think?
Very, very simple. If the council makes contact, do not make any response to them under any circumstances. Seek help. Yeah. It costs nothing to make a phone call to our firm, speak to somebody and say, this is my situation. Can you help me? What do I need to do next? And there's a variety of services that we provide, and I won't go into them. They're all on our website, landlordsdefence.co.uk, which I'll put up at the end. But Landlords Defence is a resource of information, free information for people to work out what they need to work out. And one of the things that we will be launching in June is do I need a license checker? Because it's great going onto a council website to check whether you need a license, but you know, when you type in the address, now they know that you've typed in that address. It's now in their database or their intelligence for them to go, well, let me see who's living at that property then.
Yes, it's very sneaky.
Oh yes,
but they do it.
I confirmed that with Enfield Council when they said, oh, we've got a checker, you can do this or you can call. And they confirmed to me that they keep that information. By the way, if you're in Enfield, Selective Licensing comes in 1st of September, and you should get ready to
everywhere.
Enfield, London Borough of Enfield, Selective
Licensing. Everywhere in Enfield.
No, there are certain wards, and it's on their website. There's no harm in looking on their website if you go incognito, but don't put in any address for them. But in June,
if you got some landlords who you don't like.
Yeah, well, there is that to it. Again, we're going to do a checker, so we will do we know how to do that without going onto the landlords onto the landlord section of the local authority.
Yeah,
we will check and tell you whether your address needs that. That's going to be a free checker. It's being launched in June, because we never wanted to do that. We thought, oh, people will be able to do that themselves. But the amount of people who say, I went and checked on the council website, and next I had a knock on the door, or there was a leaflet or something coming through. So I'm not saying that Big Brother is that big and it's that good, but I'm soon to publish something about how the council go about investigating. I'm going to do it because of Enfield. I decided we should educate those landlords, so do look out for that. But call us. We will tell you whether we can help you. If we can't help you, of course, you can find everything on our website. We'll send you there. If that doesn't answer it, it's clear that you need some consultancy help. We offer a range of services. They start from £60 up to thousands and thousands, depending on how serious it is. But, you know, for £60, you can find out most of the stuff that you need in a call with a real live living person who lives and breathes and fights councils on a daily basis. So, yeah, I would advise, don't be afraid. The most expensive price you will pay in property today, and I hate to say it, is the price is zero. If you are looking for advice and you pay zero for it, it's probably worthless. And I love Facebook. Please don't get me wrong. I love LinkedIn. I love social media. But does the person answering really know what they're talking about? I saw one yesterday, a picture of a flue on a right angular wall, a window, and the tenant had said to the landlord, I think I can smell carbon monoxide in my room. And in the conversation, somebody wrote, well, it looks more than the 30 centimeters it needs to be, so I don't think there's anything wrong. And my response was immediately get professional help, because the manslaughter charge you're going to get for the dead tenant is a lot more expensive than the free advice that person just gave you. Yeah. Now, again, they are now going to take work. They've taken the advice. They are going to do what needs to be done, but they wouldn't do it until I'd actually put in the post who I was, what my company was, and what I do. Now, most people will throw me out of a group because I did that, thinking I want business. No, I just want to save lives and show my authority. So again, free is not a good price to pay.
I love science fiction, and there's a Ferengi rule of acquisition from Star Trek, which you'll appreciate. And the rule of acquisition is free advice is seldom cheap.
Absolutely. I think that absolutely. And Star Trek today, when I was a kid, Star Trek it was just a dream. But a lot of those things, the video phone and the beam me up, Scotty, they just haven't quite
not
teleported.
Quite there yet. It's a shame, because I could get to England for my fish and chips a heck of a lot easier.
But maybe that's what they're going to do with the coronavirus. Maybe the vaccine will turn you into teleportation. But anyway, that's the humorous side of it. I don't know whether it will ever do that. But the conspiracy theorists will think it will.
Well, thank you so much for having me on and let me ask all these questions. Really appreciate your time. I know you're very busy and things, but thank you so much for letting me ask all these questions.
All right. Well, Dan Latto, thank you very, very much. And maybe we should start doing this more regularly. Maybe lunch with Latto.
Yeah, it's got a nice ring to it, as long as you're paying.
Well, I don't know. We can do a virtual one. Brilliant. All right, Dan. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye.